So now we talk about a very important and very interesting era in the history of Egypt, the Egyptian campaign by Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, as we said before, France in the 18th century had gone through a very enlightening phase in its development. It had consolidated power and had gone through various revolutions and the Enlightenment. And so France became a competing force within Europe, second only to Britain. The French had it in mind, however, to dominate Egypt and Syria in order to safeguard their economic interests, but also to pursue a strategic alliance with Tipu Sultan so that they can rebuff the British influence in that region. Napoleon, a young and ambitious general who modeled himself after Alexander the Great, sought to carve out a legacy of his own. He was appointed as the right man for this important mission and therefore headed the French expedition to Egypt in 1798. One thing to keep in mind here is that we talk of Napoleon as a very huge influence in history and a very mighty general and even an emperor in the end. But many of us don't actually realize just how young he was at the time. When Napoleon led his armies into Egypt, he wasn't even 30 years old at the time. He was only 29. However, Egypt at the time was considered a backwater. It had been many centuries since Egypt and the European world had come into close contact. However, Egypt was still considered a province of the Ottoman Empire since Sultan Selim's conquest in 1517. So Napoleon's presence was a direct affront to the Ottomans. However, he presented himself to the Egyptian people as a friend of the Sultan who had come to liberate them from the Mamluk menace. Napoleon defeated the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids and conquered Egypt. And it was really an amazing, magnificent feat considering the odds against him. Napoleon's entry into Egypt itself was against all odds. He didn't come in prepared in terms of clothing and food and water, and he didn't have many accurate maps to guide him. Yet he managed to keep his army intact, although many of them died on the way. They managed to keep an army strong enough to be able to face the Mamluks when they arrived in the mainland. Following the defeats of the Mamluks, a magnificent defeat, he then declares himself a friend of the Sultan and goes on to forge a new image in Egypt. He calls himself Ali Bonaparte Pasha. He addresses the Muslim crowds and informs them that he is not a Christian and neither are his army. In fact, he was looking to convert to Islam. Now, all of these are political ploys, of course, to win the trust of the locals. And he went as far as visiting mosques each Friday to accompany those faithful who went to pray. However, the French presence in Egypt ruffled a few feathers because the local Muslim population grew very discomfited by the open display of French dominance and by the fact that Napoleon was taxing them to death to keep his army going. But perhaps most concerning to the local Muslims was the flagrant disregard for their modesty and their culture. Many of them would see young Egyptian women accompanying French soldiers in public without veils and without the traditional clothing. And this, of course, was an affront to the local Muslim population. Clerics therefore began to preach in the local mosques and call for faithful Muslims to gather at the Al-Azhar Mosque in a coordinated effort to spark a revolt, which resulted in the furious and indiscriminate assault of all and any Frenchmen in sight. Napoleon's response was explosive. He ordered that the cannons be directed towards Al-Azhar and relentlessly bombarded the building for 12 hours. Remnants of this furious episode can still be seen today. The Muslim dissidents were rounded up and transported to the Cairo citadel, where they would be secretly beheaded in the middle of the night and their bodies discarded into the Nile River. Despite his political guile and populist strategies, Napoleon's occupation of Egypt was short-lived, and his reign over the country lasted little under 3 years. His campaign was severely compromised following the crushing defeat suffered at the hand of the great British naval commander, Horatio Nelson, at Abu Qir in what is known historically as the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon lost many battleships, and reinforcements, and this would actually have an impact on his campaign in Egypt later on. Now, at the same time, the Ottomans were very wary of what was happening in Egypt, and Selim III sought help from Britain and Russia in order to support him against Napoleon. But because he didn't have a strong enough navy, he had to rely on that of the British and the Russians. Consequently, the British offered support to the Sultan, of course, to safeguard their own interest in Egypt and to ensure that the resources coming out of India were not interrupted or cut off by French occupation. The Russians, on the other hand, participated in support of the Ottomans because the French were an enemy nation to the Russians at the time. Although the relationship between Russia and the Ottomans was also hostile, they had decided to cooperate against a common enemy, which was France. Thereafter, Napoleon and his French forces were driven out of Egypt by the joint Ottoman, British and Russian military coalition following the siege of Acre in 1799, and also the Battle of Abu Qir, as we mentioned before. By 1802, the French were completely vanquished and out of the Middle East. However, they left major remnants behind. Napoleon himself returned to France and became the emperor within a few weeks. In a rare twist of ingenuity, he successfully portrayed his misadventure in Egypt as a soaring conquest and managed to captivate the hearts and minds of the French people. The pivotal point in modern Arabic and Islamic history has often been attributed and traced back to a single point in time, 1798, when Napoleon invades Egypt. This brief but very impactful period between 1798 and 1801 set forth a template for the projection of the history of the Arab and Muslim world. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt and incursion into the Ottoman realms was of a major disturbance and had sent shockwaves throughout the Muslim world. The Egyptians themselves were startled by this event, which awoke their collective conscience towards a new perspective and experience, one that would entirely shift their trajectory from that moment onwards. Sheikh Abdurrahman al-Jabarti, an Egyptian chronicler and contemporary of Napoleon, echoed the general sentiment of Egyptian society towards the technological advances and innovations that were brought to them by the French. He reports the following: "They achieve wonders, many of which cannot be comprehended by the minds of people like us." However, it must also be said that Napoleon was also equally fascinated by the landmarks and the riches of the country. Soon after his arrival in Egypt, he establishes an institution of scientific endeavors, and within a few months, Egypt's antiquities were being documented, surveyed, and studied by Napoleon's engineers, artists, and scientists. They successfully captured vast amounts of information and produced detailed literary inventory, which would open up Egypt to the Orientalist world for the first time in many centuries. Officers in Napoleon's army even discovered a strange stone with inscriptions in the region of Rashidiyah. It had foreign writing etched into it and looked interesting enough for them to transport back to France with them. This artifact later came to be known as the famous Rosetta Stone, and it opens up, of course, a new chapter in the history of Egypt and the study of Egyptology. But it was, again, by virtue or perhaps misadventure of Napoleon's entry into Egypt and his interest in the Egyptian culture and what Egypt had to offer. Napoleon's influence over Egypt, however, was not merely military, but more intellectual, economic, cultural, and technological. They witnessed a rapid influx of new sciences, technologies, and ideas during his presence in Egypt, and he exercised a great deal of influence by introducing the printing press, European engineering, medicine, and modern military disciplines. This tumultuous awakening triggered a major soul-searching wave in Egypt and throughout its neighboring regions. It was in fact a wake-up call for the Arab world to initiate herself into the modern era of science and technology if she wanted to survive into the future. Thus, the Napoleonic campaign of Egypt in 1798 opened up a new chapter in Egypt's history and by extension, the Arab Muslim world's history.